Here? Yeah? Okay. Okay, yeah, I know we were talking about this. Okay. All right, we have time for this today. All right, let's see. Okay, I'll come back to those videos in 1 second. So let's start with symbiosis. The term symbiosis means organisms live together and they rely on each other in some way. Oftentimes we might think of it as a totally positive relationship, but sometimes we can include things that one organism is harmed. So just remember it's some kind of like interaction where they really rely on each other for survival. Okay, so symbiosis includes parasitism, where you have a parasite or parasites that live in and on their host. They want to keep their host alive for a long time so that they continue to live on them and survive. Mutualism, this is probably the most common one when we're looking at symbiosis, is that both organisms benefit from this relationship. And then this one is kind of funny that it's a controversial term in ecology, commensalism. Some ecologists will argue that there are relationships where one species benefits and the other one is not harmed or benefits. But some ecologists say, no way, there's no way that you have a relationship where the other one is not harmed or benefits. So sometimes it's kind of interesting in textbooks that sometimes we'll see this in here and then it'll be taken out the next edition and put back in. A lot of times that depends on the reviewers and their backgrounds. So just to know that. Okay, so let's look. So all examples of symbiosis. Parasites. Parasites live in and on their host. Like my tick example, I had a parasite the other day. The hosts are generally weakened, but they don't want to kill them. You all might be parasites if you live with your family. Right now, you get housing and maybe a car. You get to have food there. Would it be smart to kill your family? No, right? You want to keep them alive and happy, and so that you keep benefiting. So here are some examples of parasites, when we have seasonal sicknesses, bacteria, viruses, those are parasites. Lamprey eel, they have these teeth that hook onto fish, and then even leeches as well. All right, so let's talk about mutualism. Both species benefit in this relationship. It's a mutual benefit. Oftentimes you'll see the exchange of protection and food for shelter and food. Usually the combinations of these three things between the two organisms. There's lots and lots and lots of examples of this out there. So the clownfish and anemone is often the example that people start with when they talk about mutualism. But it could be as simple as like even our microbiome, all of the organisms that live in and on us. We give them food, we give them maybe carbon dioxide, some of our oxygen, and in return they help to break down things in our body that we need or provide certain protections against diseases. This one's interesting. So if we go back and we think about mimicry that we talked about last time, that you have these neon cleaner gobies. There's what's called a saber-toothed blenny that often will join that cleaning station, and it will maybe pick a little bit of the stuff off of like a bigger fish, but then it'll like take a chunk of flesh from that fish. So it is more like a parasite, but it mimics one of the mutualistic relationships. So we have kind of an interesting thing here. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about in terms of communities are keystone species. These are species in an ecosystem, specifically within a community, that if something happens to them, the whole community starts to fall apart. So one of the things, one example are elephants, that where elephants live, they live in a combination of areas that have a lot of trees, but also a lot of other short plants. And what elephants do is elephants will take down smaller trees. And what that does, it allows like areas for big trees, but then they get rid of a lot of other trees so that there is a wide variety of smaller plants for other organisms to eat on. So if they didn't get rid of some of the smaller trees that are popping up, it would actually decrease the biodiversity of the ecosystem. All right, another example, Pisaster. These are very colorful sea stars. They're found on our west coast. There was an ecologist, his name was Robert Payne. He saw so many of these and he thought, I wonder if I get rid of these, what would happen? And so he removed most of these sea stars, and what he found was that mussels and clams just started to overrun the entire ecosystem, and the diversity of the entire ecosystem went down without having these sea stars. So the sea stars kept the clams and the mussels in check from overgrowing. And then they eventually did put them back in the ecosystem, and then the ecosystem was back in its delicate balance. The importance of energy in an ecosystem, and then we will also look at the importance of the nutrients. But I want to sort out a little bit of the difference between energy and nutrients, because in our everyday lingo, we really get them totally wrong. A little background, back to our biotic and abiotic factors, that in any ecosystem, we have important components that are biotic, but also very important components that are abiotic. Remember, biotic means the living things, and abiotic means the non-living. A, non-bio living. Okay, so let's take a look at this up here. What we have up here is an amino acid, a very simple amino acid. And when we take a look at this illustration that I have, we're seeing two things here. We're seeing the lines, which are the bonds, and then we're seeing the atoms, the carbons, the nitrogens, the hydrogens, the oxygen, and then every amino acid differs. If you remember a little bit about amino acids, if you studied them in like Bio 111, that R group makes every amino acid different. When we're taking a look at something like this, amino acids, which are the base blocks of proteins, and we know proteins give us a good energy source, but really we've got two things when we're looking at amino acids, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, is that you have both energy and nutrients in the same molecule. Everything that's circled, all of the atoms, those are your nutrients. That's the nutrient part of the amino acid. The bonds between all of the atoms, that's where your energy is. So within, again, one thing that we would maybe always call our energy source, there's really also nutrients in there. That again, the atoms are the nutrients and the bonds are the energy. The difference between the two in terms of what happens in an ecosystem is that our energy sources, the bonds, we have to replace them. When a bond is broken, it releases energy into the organism or into the system. We have a renewable source, the sun, the way the earth turns and revolves around the sun. We know that we get sun exposure every day. So that energy source on our side of the earth gets renewed daily because we get exposed to it every day. So the energy source has to get renewed. We can't keep energy. Energy goes from one component and then it gets turned into another component until it's all used up. energy decreases in ecosystems. The atoms, they're recycled. So once all of those bonds are broken apart, you're left with the atoms. And we release our atoms in terms of putting back in the ecosystem. And let's think of just two simple ways. One is by our breathing. As we breathe in oxygen, oxygen gets delivered to our cells, if you remember this from the circulatory system, that fuels our metabolism and makes it more efficient. And in return, through that process of cellular respiration, we kick out carbon dioxide. And then that carbon dioxide travels through our blood back to our lungs, and we breathe it out. So we have the nutrients that are getting constantly recycled back and forth through breathing. The other way that we are recycling our nutrients is through eating. We eat energy sources. We break down all of the bonds. We get as much energy as we can. And the atoms, we poop them out or we urinate them out. We could essentially have atoms in our body, carbons, hydrogens, oxygen, nitrogens, etc., that are billions of years old. It's pretty crazy to think about that dinosaurs could have the same atoms that we have in our body. So energy is recycled. We have to keep, energy is needs to be renewed, energy is renewed, and the nutrients are recycled. They come from our atoms within our quote unquote energy sources. The laws of thermodynamics tell us that the first law of thermodynamics states that energy is not created nor destroyed, but it is changed from one source into another source. So energy from the sun is taken up by plants. Plants make fruits, vegetables, grains, oils, etc. You have herbivores that eat those things. You have maybe omnivores who eat plants and other animals, or you have organisms that eat only animals. And that's the way that energy changes through the ecosystem, right? Sunlight energy to food energy, and then eventually broken down into its last bits and pieces. The second law of thermodynamics, one of the things about systems and energy is that it is not efficient. That as energy is changed from one source into the other, that first law of thermodynamics states that the downfall of this is that every time energy is converted, you lose about 90% of the usable energy. So energy systems are very inefficient. That's why energy has to be replenished. That 90% is lost as heat. So you brilliant minds out there, if you can figure out within biological systems or even in mechanical systems, let's say you want to be an engineer, if you can figure out how to capture that energy, that 90% that's lost, there's a huge source of renewable energy there that's just lost to the universe as heat. So people are working on that. There's a team that figured out how to harness the energy enough to light a light bulb temporarily, but just like temporarily. If we could harness that energy to fuel our electrical systems, that would be amazing because energy is constantly being changed from one source into another. The nutrients that are left, so energy constantly needs to be replaced into the system, and then the nutrients that are left, they never leave the system. They just get recycled through. So we're going to look at, so there you go. So nutrients get used and recycled and used and recycled. And they're part of that first law of thermodynamics, that energy gets changed from one thing into another, and the nutrients are the building blocks of that. But the bonds are the actual energy. So we're going to focus on the first part of the lecture on energy itself, and then we'll get to the nutrient part of it in a little more detail. So energy, most systems, energy comes to the earth from sunlight. Could be sunlight energy, electromagnetic waves, and heat. There are some ecosystems, like if we go deep down into the hydrothermal vents of the ocean where sunlight doesn't penetrate that deep, they use, instead of photosynthesis, they use a process called chemiosynthesis, where they use chemicals to fuel the energy source created in that ecosystem. And that's one thing that I always love about biology, is that every day I read the news and I learn something new. Something new is discovered, something changes. That's why I chose this science in particular, because I'm like, oh, there's always so much going on. Okay, so here's a lot of arrows and colors and organisms. So let's take a look at the arrows. So first, let's just look at solar energy, the bright yellow arrows. That you can see that solar energy is only coming into one place. It's going into the producers, or the autotrophs. We would also call them our photosynthesizers. So that's the only place we're seeing that yellow, that bright yellow. Heat energy, what we see at every step is every time you have from one organism to another, you lose heat. You have another step, lose heat, another step, you lose heat, another step over here, you lose heat. So every time energy goes from one source to another, heat energy is released. One thing I don't like about this illustration is that the heat energy arrow should be huge at every step. This should be the biggest. It should be like this big, or maybe even this big. So the heat is a very significant loss at every step. Now let's take a look at the energy stored in chemical bonds, the red arrows. So every time you go from like producers that are going to feed autotrophs or herbivores, you have the passing of energy. And then let's say that this herbivore, it dies. That energy goes to the D&Ds, the detritus and decomposers. If you have like a big organism that's eating this bird, for example, you can see energy flows to the bird, to this polar bear. And then again, every time you see the red arrow, it ends up eventually in the detritus and the detritus feeders and the decomposers. But do the red arrows ever make their way back to the producers? Do you see an arrow from any of these heterotrophs that go back to the producer? No, because they're going to utilize every bit of energy that they can. And the decomposers and the detritivores, they're going to use every last bit of energy. So energy, one of the things I want you to notice here is the red arrows, the energy arrows in the bonds, they do not recycle back to the beginning. But then let's take a look at the nutrients. So the nutrients, again, we can see side by side with the red, right? So we've got them, okay? So the nutrients go into the producers, and then some go back into the decomposers, and some go to the heterotrophs. But from the D&Ds, do the blue arrows go back to the producers? Yes, right? So in this illustration, you can see that the nutrients are the only thing in this illustration that's recycled. All of the energy sources, they go to an end. So good thing, like if I popped this onto an exam and said something about the, if I had the colored arrows, what's the deal with the blue arrows? What would it be? Would it be nutrients, or would it be energy from the sun? And you would know, oh yeah, that's the nutrients, because the nutrients are recycled. Okay, so producers produce their own energy. I like that term. Mostly through the sun, but often can be chemicals. We start out with the process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis pops out one of our simple large molecules, which is glucose or sugar. But then that glucose can go into other metabolic pathways to become other kinds of carbohydrates, could become amino acids, proteins, lipids, anything that we need in our body, that from that basis of photosynthesis, making sugar, the sugar goes into other metabolic pathways to become anything else that we need through our metabolism. Here is the process of photosynthesis: sunlight energy, carbon dioxide, and water. So these three arrows on your left side, those are what we start with in photosynthesis, and then what we get is the release of oxygen and then sugar, but then again, sugar can also become other things in other metabolic pathways. So here are our main groups of photosynthesizers: plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. We call them autotrophs. Auto means self. Troph means feeder. When we're talking about autotrophs, self feeders, we don't mean like you and I, how we are, big enough to feed ourselves. That's not what it means when we're talking the metabolism of energy. We're talking about that within the cells of these organisms, they can undergo photosynthesis to make their own energy within their cells. So they can feed themselves from their own cells. The great thing about them is they can do photosynthesis, and the products of photosynthesis can go into cellular respiration, get broken down, and they can do that whole processing of energy, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration within their own cells. Whereas we have to input energy and breathe in oxygen in order to start our process of cellular respiration. So very sophisticated. Consumers, they rely on other organisms for their energy. They consume their energy. We call these heterotrophs. Hetero means other, and then again, troph means feeder. What that means is they have to feed themselves from some other source outside of their own cells or bodies. So you have to have an input of energy from some other organism. Let's talk a little bit about primary productivity or productivity in general in an ecosystem. What we mean by productivity is the amount of energy that the producers can bring into an ecosystem. How productive are our organisms and our ecosystems? So photosynthesis is the main source, again, of productivity in an ecosystem. But depending on, if we're talking about, like I said, hydrothermal vents, we might have a little bit different source of our energy. The term primary productivity refers to all of the energy that the producers can bring into the ecosystem. So everything. Primary productivity will depend on a number of things. How much nutrients are available? Sunlight is a huge one. Is it somewhere near the equator? Typically what we find are ecosystems near the equator are more productive because they have copious amounts of sunlight. The earth is always tilted toward the sun. Water, critical to any bio type of reaction. We need water for making and breaking biological molecules. Temperature. It's an easy principle. Things move faster when they're warm. They move slower when they're cold. So just taking a look at this illustration here, I know it says, that's what the numbers mean. The numbers essentially mean that the higher the number, the more productive the ecosystem. So here, if we take a look at this, the tropical rainforests, they are the most productive on this picture. If we take a look at the open ocean, for example, open ocean has tons of water. It has tons of sunlight. Temperature, depending on where you're at in the ocean, could be, let's just say you're near the equator in the ocean. But nutrients, because the ocean is so vast, it's so big, nutrients get spread out amongst the whole ocean. And so if you're out in the open ocean where, like the difference between a coral reef where there's tons of organisms and lots of nutrients are being recycled because there's tons of organisms, but then you go out to the middle of the ocean and there's hardly any organisms, there's not nutrients being recycled there. There's not a lot of nutrients available. So out in the open ocean, just that one of the four factors, if one of the four factors is low, it can really slow down your productivity. Same thing with deserts. Deserts have tons of sunlight, nice warm temperatures. They're often relatively diverse, but water availability is super low. So then you have a very low number. If you take a look at our area, like temperate deciduous forest, it is one of the next, so estuaries are next to tropical rainforest, and then the temperate deciduous forest, so we just like look out there, our number goes down 1,000 from tropical rainforests because we have winter. If we didn't have winter, this number would be right on par with the rainforest. But because we have that winter and then the, kind of like end of spring and beginning of fall, that we have those temperatures that start to lower and water availability lowers, that our numbers go down. Okay, so energy in the pyramid of energy flow, we put it into a pyramid of energy. What we call each level is we call it a trophic level. Trophic also means feeding, like heterotroph. Remember we said that's a feeder word. So we have these different levels. So let's start out with our primary producers at the base. We would call these our autotrophs. These are your plants, your algae, and your cyanobacteria. So we're going to have a lot of these. This is going to be a pretty large trophic level in comparison to the others. Our second trophic level are our primary consumers. These are the herbivores in our ecosystem. Now we're talking heterotrophs because they have to get their energy from some other source. Our third trophic level will be what we call our omnivores. We also call them our secondary consumers, our second level of consumers. They're heterotrophs also. Omnivore, omni means many, they eat many things. So in looking at these herbivores here, they get their energy source from the autotrophs. If we're looking at our secondary consumers, they get energy from them below, but also from the primary producers. So most of you are probably omnivores. You eat plant matter and you eat animal matter. If you're in vegetarian or vegan, you'd be on this level. Most of you would be on this level. Let's say that you're on a keto diet where you're eating mostly plant matter. Then you're on the fourth trophic level. Your heterotrophs. And again, these, yeah.
Is the secondary consumers mostly omnivores? Because it says carnivores or omnivores on here.
They could be carnivores or omnivores.
So it doesn't matter.
No, even so kind of interesting. These ones at the top that are mostly carnivores. Some of your secondary could be carnivores. most organisms at these two levels, when you're talking consumers, most of them will all eat some primaries and some secondaries. So they're usually eating from every level. On occasion, you have these at the top. When we're talking about our top carnivores, you're talking apex. Apex means top. Most organisms, like dogs, for example, dogs eat a variety of plant matter and meat matter. Cats, for example, cats are unique. There's not that many animals in the world that are what we would call a hypercarnivore. Hypercarnivores mean like cats pretty much, they just eat meat. So the way like house cats, if you feed them the like, we call it cereal in our house, the like the food, the dry food. Yeah. So the dry food has a bunch of like plant matter in it, usually a lot of grains in it. Cats don't eat that. That's if they're out in the wild, they pretty much are just eating other animals. And that's what we call a hypercarnivore. Cats also, we can tell that because cats have very short digestive systems. They don't have a digestive system for plant matter. You need a very long digestive system for plant matter. So very few of these are strictly carnivores, or these strictly carnivores. Occasionally at these levels you do have some carnivores. But really what you're seeing is that every level is usually eating some of all the levels below you. We could go up again and we could go to quaternary consumers. And again, those are probably your hypercarnivores, like polar bears are another example of a hypercarnivore. So we could go up a few more levels in an ecosystem. So here's another kind of like picture of what I have here, is that you've got all of these. You can see that what I've done here is I've pointed the arrows upward. Here, arrows are pointing upward. One of the things that you really need to understand when you're looking at these illustrations is that the arrows go where the energy flows. So you might want to write that down. The arrows go where the energy flows. Remember that it's not like, and especially if you look at maybe these two levels here, that it's not the arrow points to what they're eating, because that wouldn't make any sense, right? Do bunny rabbits eat snakes? No, right? Snakes eat bunny rabbits. So the energy from the bunnies is flowing to the snakes. So just, like if you get confused or you're like, oh my gosh, I can't remember that arrow thing, just think like, are they eating them, or is the energy flowing from them to them? So if a wolf eats a rodent that ate a smaller insect that ate a plant, the wolf would be which one of these? If you need to, go back here and put them on your pyramid. Yeah, good. Okay, so the wolf would be a tertiary, because we have here, if we go back and we go plant, and then we had a plant that ate an insect, rodent, wolf. So easy ways to figure that out, that we have all of our levels mapped out there. All right, here's another example of things that they put in textbooks. This one I'm not super fond of. This one I'm kind of half fond of, and I'll tell you why. That what it's showing here, and you've got the arrows showing where the energy flows, but this is not very descriptive of what's actually going on in the ecosystem. So here you have, and this might be true, that you have a plant that gets eaten by this kind of caterpillar. This kind of caterpillar may only eat that kind of plant, but do you think this bird only eats this kind of caterpillar? Probably eats a variety of things, right? And does this hawk eat only this kind of bird? Probably not, right? And so what we're seeing here is what they call a food chain. And it's just showing you like these levels through the example of single organisms. Now here in this one, the first part is very descriptive. It really shows you that you have a variety in the ocean of what we call phytoplankton. Remember, I talked about this a long time ago. Plankton are things that just kind of get pushed with the currents. They have no control of where they go. There's a whole layer of plankton in the ocean, and phytoplankton, these are the photosynthesizers. They're the producers in the ecosystem, and you've got a big variety of them. Their energy is being flowed into the zooplankton. It's a kind of like a mini zoo-like organisms, and there's a wide variety of them. They're getting their energy from, or the energy is flowing from the primary producers to them. And kind of then everything else falls apart here because we know that this energy is also flowing to the fish and it's eventually flowing to the shark. That also these fish, yeah, maybe they eat a big variety of this, but they also might eat other things as well. And then this shark definitely doesn't only eat this kind of fish. So these examples, these food chains are not very descriptive of what actually happens. Is that even in the example of omnivores, that omnivores eat a variety of things, right? We've got a lot of arrows between the first level all the way up to the third level. So we've got a lot of variety there. So let's analyze this sentence. Do you agree with me that eating oranges is healthy? Right? Okay, that's reasonable. How about this? Eating only oranges is healthy? No. Okay, so that's like the idea of where the food chain falls apart. Is eating one thing is not healthy for you. We need to get a variety of nutrients. Even if you are a carnivore, you eat a variety of different things below you, maybe animals here and animals there. But remember that those animals are getting their nutrients and energy from sources inside of their body, a variety. So you're getting that variety even as a carnivore. You're getting all of the nutrients that the things you ate, what they ate, and they ate, and they ate. So we look at what's called a food web. A food web says that a lot of organisms are eating many of the same things, many different things, and so it gets really kind of messy when we take a look of who's eating whom and who's eating what. So here is like a little mini food web that what we're seeing, and especially like, let's take a look at this mouse here, that this mouse has a lot of arrows around it because a lot of predators, so like for example, the energy is flowing to owls, so owls eat mice, and then badgers eat mice, and snakes eat mice, and hawks eat mice. And so you can see that a lot of things eat this one kind of organism, that you have a lot of overlap, so that it gets to look kind of like a spider web where things overlap. Remember again, the arrows show or go where the energy flows. So if I put this on an exam, something like this, and I asked you about different trophic levels, like is this mouse, what trophic level is this mouse, then you would see what arrows are pointing to the mouse. So I can see this grass here is pointing to the mouse, and that's it for now. So that if I looked at this, I would go, okay, so the mouse, the only arrow that's pointing to the mouse is from, yeah. So that I know that it is just a, right, good, very good. Okay, so you want to make sure that you take a look at that stuff. Okay, now, a lot of times people will say that this is the base of the food web, that the producers are the base of the food web. But then there's people who argue, but what happens to the last bits of energy and nutrients in the ecosystem? That there's something else that's doing that conversion of energy and the recycling of the nutrients. So if we take a look at really another two big groups that are also included in here, that surrounding all of this are the detritivores and decomposers. So that when we're looking at energy, that all the last bits of energy, when they die, when all of these in the middle of our pyramid die, the last bits of energy are being taken by the detritivores and the decomposers, and they're using that up. And then also remember that nutrients, they're going to take all the nutrients here, and with the nutrients, they're going to bring the nutrients back to this level. So the base of the food web, oftentimes, which is said in some textbooks to be the producers, it's really the detritivores and the decomposers, that they're getting that last bit there. So it's kind of like, are you talking about energy coming in? Are you talking about using the last bits of energy, talking about that base? But regardless of what you're going to call the base, just remember that the D&Ds are really, really important in this whole pyramid as well. And they're often not drawn on the pyramid. Okay, so let's just reflect back on these. Remember, if you're a detritivore, that you're eating dead things, you're eating the waste of things. We've got a wide variety of worms, plus millipedes, many insects. Scavengers, we see them all the time here, the vultures. You see the vultures going in circles above all of the forest preserves here, that they're scavenging, getting any dead things, they're eating them. Right, yeah. When you're talking about detritivores, they're extracting those last bits of energy. So again, they're part of the outer triangle here. And then they're going to recycle nutrients as well. All right, so then there's the decomposers, and they do the other things that the detritivores don't do. So they're eating the detritivores, or the detritivores' waste, everybody else's waste. They're breaking down the last bits. There's so much overlap between the two groups. They're just, some groups are specifically detritivores and some decomposers. Remember again, outside of this idea of energy that we have here on our pyramid, that the detritivores and the decomposers are bringing nutrients back to the producers, so the producers can continue to grow and have the parts to grow and then make food sources for everybody else, and the cycle then continues with the nutrients. Our main groups of decomposers are bacteria and fungi, but again, there's other ones that get qualified into that as well. If you remember a little bit about the fungi don't ingest like we do. They don't take their energy sources inside of their body. They digest them outside of their body. That's why you see mushrooms and molds growing on stuff, as they're covering it. They're kind of like releasing all their enzymes onto there, their acids onto there, and they're sucking it back in. Without decomposers and detritus feeders in an ecosystem, plants would eventually die. Yeah. Plants would soon develop nutrient deficiencies. Oh, that sounds good too, right? Let's read on. Dead material would accumulate. Nobody's breaking it down. The soil quality would get poorer, right? That goes back to nutrients, all of the above. Yeah, so a lot would go wrong if you didn't have your Ds or your D&Ds in an ecosystem. So back to this idea of the laws of thermodynamics. Energy transfer is inefficient, that approximately only 10% of energy gets passed on. that with these levels, that while we have all these little arrows that keep going from one level to the next, energy flows, that at every one of these arrows, so if we just looked at, let's say, this arrow, there's a heat arrow where you're losing about 90% of what is going from here to here. Really, when you add these two together, you've got about 10% that's going from there to there, but 90% approximately is lost at heat. So every one of these arrows has one of these to go with it. All right, other reasons why energy is lost. So that's a big one. A little bit about productivity, that when we're taking a look at primary productivity, we also have to consider net productivity. Net productivity means that the plants can bring in, let's say plants, algae, cyanobacteria, they can bring in a whole bunch of energy, but don't they have to grow their own bodies? If we're thinking about a tomato plant, so tomato plant that you might grow this summer, are you eating the whole plant, or do you just eat part of the plant? Okay, so the energy from the sun is growing that. It's also growing the fruits that you're eating. Tomatoes technically are a fruit. And so a lot of it's going into its own processes, and only some of it is actually passed on. So you lose energy in the system in that way. Cellulose, which is it's a protective mechanism for a lot of plants, just means fiber. It's very difficult for most organisms to eat and process. So many organisms avoid certain kinds of plants because they're just too hard to eat. So this one's a little bit more descriptive, kind of like my little arrow and big arrow here, that you can see when we're taking a look at this illustration that the heat arrow is very big. But again, it's not that much bigger than that, but it should be probably like 8 times bigger than this. I also want you to notice that within our little trophic pyramid that we have, this is the base of our pyramid, like what I'm showing here. And then this is really all of these surrounding. That from our primary producers, the amount of energy that's flowing through the trophic pyramid, look at the size of the arrows, are very small in comparison to what goes to the D&Ds. So they're really, and this shows you in scale that they're really getting a lot of that primary energy. Also, again, those heat arrows, they would be much bigger even than they are here. All right, so as I keep saying, the pyramid of energy is 90% inefficient. If you want to be like, let's look at the glass half full, you could say that it's 10% efficient if you want to focus on the efficiency. Be careful, if I ask a question on the exam, I may ask how efficient is the transfer of energy, or I may ask how inefficient. Make sure you are careful to recognize, am I asking for 90% inefficient or 10% efficient? So just kind of get that in the back of your heads. Because usually if I ask a question like that, people don't always read it correctly. All right, so 10% of 10% of 10%, 10% law, which means that if we're looking at somebody up here, and we're looking at, let's say, a molecule that comes in to the primary producers, they're getting 10% of 10% of 10%. So there's a reason why we don't have as many of these up here, because the energy flow is slow up to them. And you can see the calculations here. Or here. That a consumer up here is only getting 1 of 1,000 calories that are brought in by a producer. All right, more about energy pyramids. When we're looking at the main inside pyramid, we have more primary producers than we do have consumers, because they're the ones that are bringing the energy in. They're the autotrophs. So you got to have a lot of autotrophs to supply energy to everybody. And then you get less and less and less because the flow of energy is less efficient the higher you go in your pyramid. Let's talk about another thing, another reason why we have less as we go up. There's an issue with toxins in our ecosystems that is magnified by what's called biological magnification or biological amplification. So what this means is that if we take a look at our producers, and if our producers, like let's say out here on our prairie, that they spray all kinds of toxic chemicals out there on our prairie, they're going to, with absorbing water, they're going to absorb a lot of toxins into their bodies. The toxins that they absorb are going to be passed to who eats them. So this level is going to get a lot of their toxins. The more that you eat of them that are toxic, the more toxins you have in your body. But here's another thing. We know that everybody eats some of this, with the exception of hypercarnivores, as I mentioned, but everybody's eating some of these. But let's say you're here and you eat something here. You might think, oh, they're not going to get that many toxins because they're not eating where the toxins came into the ecosystem. But when they eat one of these, they also accumulate all of the toxins that this thing ate. So if this ate a whole bunch of these and a lot of these, they're getting the toxins of everything that this one ate. So as you go up higher in the ecosystem, you're getting the toxins of the chain of who you ate and the toxins they accumulated. You're digesting them into your body. And a lot of those toxins, then let's say that, some of the toxins go to the D&Ds. And guess what the D&Ds do? They recycle the toxins back to here. So that's a good insight, but it depends on if the decomposers can break down those toxins. They can do the work of making those toxins non-toxic, but most organisms are not equipped like that. So you have to think of what they ate and what they ate and what they ate and what they ate and they ate. And so as you are higher up, you're getting an accumulation of more toxins in the ecosystem. All right, so a little bit about these kinds of toxins. Most toxic substances will have stabilizers like chlorine. Chlorine makes a toxic molecule last longer than it naturally would degrade. So you'll see things like chlorine and other kinds of atoms that make it very stable and last in the system. It helps that farmers then don't have to keep buying pesticides or herbicides because the molecules that they put on the first time are very stable and will last a really long time. But they also last a really long time through the cycling of this whole system. If a toxin, so here's where you get to, if something's biodegradable, that a toxin could be broken down into degraded parts and not be toxic anymore, not last anymore. But again, as I mentioned, not all organisms are able to biodegrade all toxins. Some are, but those are often not in an ecosystem. Or there may be little in an ecosystem, I should say. When you eat something, the molecules that you can't break down or are over your calorie amount, if you remember back to digestion, that when you eat over a certain amount of calories, your body stores it in your fat. When you have these toxins, what your body does is it's just like, I don't know what to do with this, I'm going to put it in your fat. So now, as you go up these levels, a lot of fat is used by especially the higher consumers, that they're going to eat those fatty parts and then they're going to store it in their fat. The higher up you are, it means that whatever you ate and then whatever they ate and whatever they ate and whatever they ate, you're getting all the toxins of historically every level of what the thing ate behind you. So you're getting levels and levels and levels of toxins magnifying into your body. So think about yourself. If you are here, if you are a vegetarian or a vegan, or let's say you don't eat a lot of meat, you're getting a lot less toxins because you're only getting the toxins from the autotrophs. If you are somebody who eats a lot of meat, you eat meat every day, almost every meal, you're getting a lot more toxins. So while we're looking at natural systems, these toxins, they also accumulate in humans. So this kind of stuff, that you don't eat this, right? We don't eat this or the Dunkin' cup, right? We don't eat this, but this will photodegrade or chemically degrade in a landfill. And then the microplastics that are produced, it'll break down into teeny, teeny, teeny microscopic pieces of plastic. And then they'll go into our water table. And then they'll come up here and then flow through our system. So even toxins that we don't mean to consume, they're making their way into our autotrophs. And nowadays, we're getting a lot more toxins just from like outside of the pyramid than we normally would. We're also seeing phenomena like colon cancer is happening in a lot younger people. There are many different kinds of diseases we're seeing in people younger and younger. A lot more cancers, a lot more heart disease, diabetes, and they believe that's all linked to our convenient nature that we've created for ourselves. So it's hard, right? Like I can see a whole bunch of like single-use things in this room, but that's the way our life has gone. How do you get around it? Like just one easy thing is I make my own coffee. I get really, really good coffee. I make cold brew coffee every day so that I use this and I'm not getting that plastic. We try when I have a choice, like if we're out and about, my son's like, I want to have a Coke. If there are choices between aluminum, plastic, and glass, I'm like, choose the glass bottle, then choose the aluminum, then choose the plastic. So you just have to be like careful as a consumer, but it's so hard because it's everywhere in our lives. All right, so again, like it's hard. We're not immune to it, and we're getting less and less immune to it because of our convenient lifestyle. It's another reason, not just the energy flow, but the amount of toxins, the bioaccumulation is really hitting these levels hard. So this is a good visual, and regardless of what the numbers mean, that let's say in our water you have this amount of toxins, that when the plankton, the producers, when they take water in to build their molecules, they're getting this amount of toxins. And if you are a primary consumer, you're getting this amount of toxins. Secondary consumer, imagine if we go to even tertiary consumer, this would probably be totally filled in with red, maybe a few gaps. And if you're a quaternary consumer, it's like outside's bulging, your box is bulging with those toxins. All right, think about this. If we had 1 acre of land, let's say the apocalypse happens, we're the only ones left, everyone else, for whatever reason, our classroom survives. And we've got all this land here that we can grow stuff on. So we can make a choice. We can like, let's go to that farm and get a bunch of cows. And let's say we could feed 4 cows out there for a year, but we only can eat the cows because they're eating all of the land where we could grow plants. So let's say for a year we can survive on those 4 cows. After a year, we eat the cows, but then we have nothing else. Or we could say, forget the cows and let's grow a variety of foods out there. We could probably feed ourselves if we grew plants for ever, right? We could just keep planting the plants. So when we're looking at these systems, is the eating here, you can survive longer by just eating here than you can if you're up here and you're eating something that's using the plants themselves. Okay, so let's, this is kind of an interesting little tidbit. I'll show you this and we'll move on to lab. If you eat seafood, so this is a great website that if you're eating seafood and you're worried about toxins, especially in the ocean where toxins can accumulate. So the categories are up at the top. If you might not be able to see: men, women, kids 6 to 12, and kids 0 to 5. And what these numbers tell you is how many times a month you should consume any of these animals. So these ones you probably don't eat. Let's find one that is more common. It's like sharks. Okay, tuna. All right, blackfin and bluefin tuna. So what it tells us up here, so these are the tunas. It's telling you that men and women should only eat tuna once a month. No, just a meal. Yeah. So you should only eat tuna once a month. If you're a kid, you know, like a bigger kid, less than once a month, maybe once every 2 or 3 months. And a baby, again, less than once a month. Let's look at grouper. So grouper, swordfish. Swordfish, look at, okay, swordfish, for example. Swordfish is 1 for men, 0 for women, 0 for kids at all. Swordfish have a lot of toxins. And if you're going like, why men versus women? Because of the reproductive, us women grow babies in their body. So it's more like if you're reproducing, if you're a woman who is going to reproduce, because the toxins you have will be fed to growing your babies. And so a woman, your toxins will go directly into there. Yeah, yeah. They were saying with the microplastics, as I was mentioning before, that they have now found microplastics. They found microplastics in placenta now. Like the mom, again, the mom's not eating a plastic bottle, right? So where's it coming from?